Hello everyone. Today I'd like to share with you once again the story of Tieu San, a single mother. She lives quietly through very ordinary days, carrying on her shoulders not only the burden of daily necessities, but also responsibilities, worries, and many things left unspoken. Tieu San's story is not loud, nor does it begin with great upheavals. It is woven instead from early morning markets, weary footsteps, and a heart long accustomed to enduring more than it ever asks for. After the afternoons when Hai quietly walked beside her, Tieu San's life seemed to slow down, to soften, and to grow less harsh in the most natural way. She still woke before dawn, still put on her familiar old jacket, and went out to the garden, bending over rows of vegetables still damp with the cold breath of the soil. Her hands still moved swiftly, skillfully, as if the work had settled deep into every rhythm of her breathing. Everything unfolded just as it always had, unchanged, yet inside her, something was different. The emptiness that had once smoldered and stretched on for years no longer weighed so heavily, no longer clung to her as a lonely ache each time evening fell and long shadows lay across the quiet village road. She still went to the market early, still sat in her usual corner, still called out to customers with the same calm, patient voice. But in the moments when she lifted her gaze to watch people pass by, Tieu San no longer felt like a woman standing quietly at the margins of life. There were brief, delicate moments when she realized she was waiting for a familiar figure to appear in the distance, and that alone was enough to soften her heart. Ly, too, gradually grew accustomed to that presence, in a way so natural it felt as if Hai had been there for a very long time. She grew used to an extra warm hand holding hers after the market closed, to the slow footsteps walking beside her along the small, dusty path. She grew used to the tall figure waiting at the end of the alley, to Hai's gentle eyes and low, warm voice softly calling her in to eat. These things were never loud or showy, they simply repeated themselves day after day. Yet it was precisely that quiet repetition that made them an ordinary, inseparable part of life for the mother and daughter. On some evenings, when everything was finally done, Tieu San would sit in silence watching Ly eat, listening to the soft murmurs of conversation nearby, and for one of the rare times, she allowed herself to relax. It was not complete joy, nor a grand hope, just a fragile sense of relief. She thought that perhaps life was, at last, showing her a little kindness by giving her peaceful afternoons, moments when she did not have to brace herself to be strong, when she did not have to remind herself to endure just a little longer. But Tieu San also forgot that for those who have grown used to living in endurance, happiness rarely arrives in bright or obvious ways. It is not loud, nor does it overwhelm. It appears quietly, light as a passing breath. And, because it comes so softly, so gently, it is fragile enough that the moment one touches it, fear follows, fear of losing it almost as soon as it is recognized, even before it can be held tightly. That day, the rain began very early. Not in sudden downpours, but heavy and unrelenting, falling steadily as if it had been destined to blanket the entire long day. When Tieu San opened her eyes, the sky was still a solid gray, dull light filtering through the rain-soaked eaves. A curtain of rain veiled the garden behind the house, pressing the vegetable beds low, every leaf soaked and weighed down, as though carrying the fatigue of the earth and sky themselves. She still put on her familiar raincoat and stepped into the garden as she did every day. The ground had turned soft and muddy beneath her feet, each step leaving a water-filled hollow behind. Tieu San bent down to gather the vegetables, her hands brushing against the icy stalks of mustard greens, a numbing chill creeping up toward her wrists. Every movement was slow, steady, and so familiar it was almost unconscious. Amid the ceaseless sound of rain, she focused only on working, as if stopping would cause everything to fall apart. Just as she finished tying the last bundle of vegetables, the phone in her pocket suddenly vibrated. The sound rang out strangely clear in the rain-filled air. Tieu San froze for a brief moment, her heart tightening for reasons she could not name. She took out her phone. The screen showed the number of the district hospital. It lasted only a second, but it was enough for a cold sensation to run down her spine, her breathing slowing before the voice on the other end began to speak. Her mother, the woman who had stood by her through all the lonely years, who helped care for Lavi from meals to bedtime, who held her granddaughter through nights of high fever and waited for Tieu San every evening when the market closed, had suddenly collapsed. The doctor's voice was even and clear, devoid of emotion, explaining the critical condition, saying she needed to be transferred urgently to a city hospital, saying the treatment costs would not be small. Each piece of information followed the next, every word falling heavily and coldly into Tieu San's ears, just like the rain still pouring endlessly onto the roof and the garden before her. Tieu San stood motionless in the waterlogged vegetable patch. Rain streamed down her hair, past her ears, into the collar of her coat, and soaked deep into her back, chilling her through, yet she no longer noticed. In her hand, the knife she used to cut vegetables slipped away without her realizing, leaving only a faint clatter against the muddy ground before disappearing into the murky water spreading around her feet. She panicked, but she did not cry. Not because she did not hurt, but because the fear came too fast, too overwhelming, compressing her emotions so tightly that they could not break into sound. Someone like Tieu San, when faced with calamity, often chose silence. That silence was neither indifference nor resignation. It was the instinct of someone long accustomed to carrying burdens, standing still, breathing deeply, holding herself together so that the unnamed emotions would not sweep her down in the middle of the rain that was covering the entire world. Tieu San did not tell Hai right away. Not because she didn't trust him, and not because she wanted to hide anything, but because deep inside her lived a very old, very familiar fear, the fear of burdening others, of having to ask for help, and most of all, the fear of becoming a weight in someone else's life. She was used to carrying everything on her own, used to managing in silence, used to the feeling that she could rely only on herself. Even when worry began to press heavily on her chest, slowing and weighing down her breath at times, she still chose to keep everything locked inside. Instead of looking for support, Tieu San threw herself into work more than ever, as if staying busy long enough would leave her no time to think. Once she finished selling her vegetables early, she asked around to see if anyone needed odd jobs done. Whatever people asked of her, she accepted, as long as it brought home a little extra money. Days were spent at the market, nights hunched over finishing small tasks others had given her. Some nights she stayed up very late, her eyes burning with exhaustion, yet the next morning she still rose early as usual, refusing to let herself slow down even a little. Her life was stretched tighter and tighter, day after day, leaving almost no space to rest. Dark circles appeared beneath Tieu San's eyes before she even realized it, standing out clearly on a face already drawn thin by lack of sleep. Her frame grew noticeably slimmer, her narrow shoulders were always slightly hunched, as if quietly carrying a weight no one else could see. At times, even she didn't realize how tired she had become. She only knew to keep going, keep working, because stopping meant having to face the worries threatening to spill over. There were evenings when the market closed late and the rain suddenly poured down again. Tieu San carried Lavi home through the cold rain, the child asleep in her arms, breathing softly, her small face nestled against her mother's rain-soaked collar. Rainwater soaked through Tieu San's back, running down her spine, numbing her with cold. Yet she continued walking steadily along the familiar road, without stopping, without complaint, as if slowing down even slightly would cause everything she was holding together to fall apart. Hoai was the one who noticed the change first. He saw that Tieu San spoke less, that the silences between them grew longer. He noticed her smile was no longer whole, appearing only briefly before fading away. Her eyes often drifted, sometimes staring into the distance, as if she were silently calculating something heavy she did not want anyone to know. Each time he asked how she was, Tieu San only curved her lips into a small smile, her voice light, trying to sound calm, as if nothing were wrong. "I'm fine." The words sounded familiar, ordinary, even gentle. But Hoai knew they were not the words of someone who was truly fine. They were the words of someone long accustomed to enduring alone, used to gathering exhaustion, anxiety, and fear deep inside, just to keep the surface calm, just to avoid troubling anyone at all, even the person standing very close, wanting to step forward. Yet held back by an unspoken silence. One afternoon, while the market was still chaotic with people coming and going, Tieu San suddenly collapsed on the spot. She fell very softly, as if her body had long since run out of strength and had simply been waiting for a single moment to let go. The unfinished bundles of vegetables rolled onto the wet ground. The cries of vendors abruptly faltered, then broke into startled murmurs of alarm. Lavie was so frightened that she burst into tears. The little girl dropped to her knees beside her mother, her small hands clinging tightly to Tieu San's, crying out for her in desperation. The sound of a child's sobs rose through the crowded market, fragile yet heartrending, causing many people nearby to freeze for a brief moment. Hoai arrived very quickly. When he bent down and lifted Tieu San into his arms, the first sensation that made him go numb was not panic, but the terrifying lightness of her weight. Her body was so thin it seemed to carry almost no weight at all, as if loosening his grip even slightly might cause her to disappear. Hoai held her tighter, realizing for the first time just how exhausted the woman who had stood quietly strong for so long truly was. On the hospital bed, as Tieu San slowly regained consciousness, the stark white ceiling came into view through a haze. She turned her head and met Hoai's gaze close by. In that instant, panic flickered in her eyes, not from pain, but from a familiar feeling, the sense that she was once again making someone worry because of her. Her voice was hoarse and very soft, as if speaking any louder would only make everything heavier. "Please don't worry about me anymore. I don't want you to be tired because of me." The words came slowly, broken, carrying both guilt and a fear she had hidden for a very long time. They left Hoai silent for a long while. He did not answer right away. He simply stood there, looking at Tieu San, letting the silence spread through the hospital room, heavy and deep, tightening around his heart little by little. Hoai sat beside the hospital bed, not reaching for her hand right away. Simply sitting there, close enough for Tieu San to know that he had never left. His voice lowered, slow but steady, each word spoken without pressure or pity, but as a clear choice. "I'm here not because of responsibility. I'm here because I want to be." Those words fell into the stillness of the hospital room, not loud, not emphasized, yet deep enough to touch the place Tieu San had always tried to keep hidden. She turned her face away, as if to avoid Hoai's gaze, as if to conceal the emotions rising too quickly in her chest. Tears slipped quietly onto the pillow, soaking a corner of the white fabric, silent, without sobs or gasps, flowing steadily like water that had been held back for far too long. Tieu San had grown used to carrying everything on her own. Used to not complaining, not leaning on anyone, so used to it that she believed being strong meant enduring in silence. She had lived that way for many years, bearing responsibility, worry, and fears she dared not name. And because she had lived like that for so long, She forgot that sometimes allowing herself to be a little weak did not mean failure. Sometimes leaning on someone is not weakness. Sometimes it is simply admitting that you are tired, that you no longer have to hold everything up by yourself. But accepting that truth, for Tieu San, was harder than anything she had ever done. It was the first time Tieu San cried in front of Hoai, not hurried tears quickly wiped away, but a long, quiet, exhausted cry. She cried for all the years she had pretended to be fine, for the fears she had never spoken, for the weariness she always hid behind a faint smile. Hoai remained there, saying nothing more, simply staying by her side, letting Tieu San cry for a long time, as if, at last, she had allowed herself to let go, if only for this moment. Ly stood beside the hospital bed, her small body almost swallowed by the white sheets. Her tiny hands, though so small, clutched her mother's hand tightly, as if afraid that letting go for even a moment would make Tieu San disappear again. She looked up at her mother with reddened eyes, wet lashes trembling, then spoke in a halting, childish voice, broken by her effort to hold back tears. "Mom, don't be tired anymore. I'll be good." Those innocent words were spoken so softly, yet they pierced straight into Tieu San's heart. She turned to look at her daughter, at the tiny face, still streaked with tears, at the little hand gripping her with all the strength it had. Her chest tightened, aching so badly she could barely breathe. In that moment, Tieu San realized more clearly than ever, if one day she were to truly collapse, the one who would suffer most would not be herself, but the child standing before her. Ly was still too young to understand everything, yet she understood one thing all too well: her mother was tired. And it was precisely that innocence, that clumsy, earnest concern, that left Tieu San no way to turn away anymore. She saw her own selfishness in continuing to grit her teeth and endure, in believing that being strong alone was enough, while forgetting that this very strain was silently weighing on her child. Tieu San gently tightened her grip on Ly's hand, a reflex, an unspoken apology. She finally understood that the strength she had once taken pride in could no longer be about fighting alone. She could not keep enduring in silence, could not continue standing in solitude, when beside her was a child who needed a mother strong enough, both in body and in spirit, to lean on. Hoai quietly took care of the hospital expenses for Tieu San's mother. He didn't ask many questions, nor did he make her explain herself or hesitate. Everything was handled quickly and neatly, as if it were simply something he was meant to do, not a special favor. He never claimed credit, never brought it up again, and never made Tieu San feel indebted. When things had temporarily settled, Hoai stood beside her and lowered his voice until it nearly blended into the still air of the hospital. "What concerns you also concerns me." Just a simple sentence, no embellishment, no grand promises, yet it made Tieu San tremble. Not because emotion surged violently, but because something deeper reached the place she had kept tightly closed for many years. She stood there, unable to speak, feeling as though the defenses she had built for so long were beginning to crack. Tieu San had never imagined that there would be a man willing to step into her life, a life filled with burdens, worries, and responsibilities, without hesitation. He did not ask how much he would have to carry, did not weigh whether it was worth it. He simply stepped in and stood there, steady and unwavering. The thought tightened her heart, filling it with both fear and warmth, as if for the first time she realized that some people come not to be leaned on, but to share the load calmly and sincerely. Hoai quietly took care of the hospital expenses for Tieu San's mother. He didn't ask many questions, nor did he make her explain herself or hesitate. Everything was handled quickly and efficiently, as if it were simply something he was meant to do, not a special act of help. He never claimed credit, never mentioned it again, and never made Tieu San feel indebted. When things had temporarily settled, Hai stood beside her and lowered his voice until it nearly blended into the stillness of the hospital. What matters to you also matters to me. It was just a simple sentence, unadorned, without grand promises, yet it made Tieu San tremble. Not because emotion burst forth violently, but because something deeper reached straight into a place she had kept tightly sealed for many years. She stood there, unable to speak, feeling as though the defenses she had built for so long were slowly beginning to crack. Tieu San had never imagined that there would be a man willing to step into her life, a life full of burdens, worries, and responsibilities, without hesitation. He did not ask how much he would have to carry, did not weigh whether it was worth it. He simply stepped in and stood there, steady and unwavering. The thought tightened her heart, filling it with both fear and warmth, as if for the first time she realized that some people come not to be leaned on, but to share the weight quietly and sincerely.
Xin chào tất cả mọi người đã quay lại với kênh của mình. Ôi trời ơi, đau lưng quá. Tạm biệt mọi người, hẹn gặp lại mọi người ở video sau, bye bye.